Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the time granted tonight to further discuss a crisis on First Nations, the crisis of fire safety. According to a study done by the Government of Canada, First Nations living on reserve are 10 times more likely to die in a house fire than people living anywhere else in Canada. 10 times, Mr. Speaker. And this isn't isolated just to one region or only a few communities. This is a crisis that is occurring in communities across the country on a regular basis. I have spoken to dozens of people in the last couple of months, not to mention the families that I have visited with in my riding who have personal experiences with death due to house fires. Members of communities from across the country have gotten in touch with me to share their stories of grief and devastation, what they feel, what their community goes through when a tragic house fire occurs. In my home province of Manitoba, investigations have demonstrated that residents of Manitoba First Nations are far more likely to die in house fires than people living off reserve because of the systemic underfunding of infrastructure. Fire fatalities are so high because in many communities, the First Nations are struggling with outdated and overcrowded housing, as well as a lack of necessary resources to respond to fires when they happen. In fact, although fires on reserve make up less than 5% of all fires in my home province, they tragically account for up to half the fatalities. The Minister has this information, which is why, along with the hundreds of First Nations communities, me and colleagues of mine are left wondering why it is that nothing has changed. Despite the clear evidence that the current way of doing things is not working, the Minister refuses to acknowledge the need for him to take action, and the government's role in ensuring fire safety in First Nations is a priority. A 2012 study found that on 5 reserves, with a combined population of 13,000, they had the resources to budget roughly $18 per person for fire services. However, 5 non-reserve communities of the same size had the resources to allocate $51 per person. 18 on reserve per person, 51 off reserve per person. This federal government and past federal governments have remained silent on this crisis. The Minister continues to download the blame onto communities that are facing a real need in terms of resources, all while knowing full well that like education, infrastructure on fire safety is funded less than half of what residents in non-First Nations communities receive. The high numbers of fire fatalities on reserve clearly demonstrates that something is wrong. The system is broken. A 2010 federal report identified a number of recommendations to improve fire safety on reserve, including evaluating the funding for resources and fire safety education. My question is, what has happened to those recommendations? What actions have been taken by this government to ensure that all communities have the same access to the fire services they so desperately need? Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to respond to the question raised by the member for Churchill. The original question, of course, dealt with a terrible tragedy in a reserve in northern Saskatchewan, and I would like to start by offering our thoughts and condolences to the families and the community of Makwa-Sagahigan First Nation. The loss of life is a great tragedy, especially when it involves children, Mr. Speaker, and no one can be left untouched by such a terrible event. Provincial fire investigation officials are currently investigating the cause of that fire. Aboriginal Affairs in Northern Development Canada continues to monitor the situation through communication with local fire officials and the First Nation. Let me assure the House that the health and safety of First Nations communities is a top priority for our government. We provide annual funding to First Nations across Canada to meet the needs of their communities, and this includes funding for fire protection. In the case of Makwa-Sagahigan First Nation, since 2006, Aboriginal Affairs in Northern Development Canada has provided an average of $17,900 per year for the operation and maintenance of the community's fire hall and fire truck. The Department has provided an additional $14,700 annually to the First Nation for fire protection. Moreover, we spent $45,000 in 2006 to purchase a fire truck for this First Nation. It's important to remember that although Aboriginal Affairs in Northern Development Canada earmarks funds for certain purposes, First Nations are ultimately the ones who choose what the money is spent on. Mr. Speaker, we understand that everyone has an important role to play in fire prevention and to ensure that all homes and families are prepared in the event of a fire. That is why we're committed to working together with willing partners, whether they are individual First Nations, tribal councils, local fire safety authorities, and national and regional organizations to ensure that First Nations have the tools they need to keep their families and communities safe. Raising awareness about the importance of fire safety and prevention throughout the year is an important part of our government's efforts to prevent fires and fire-related injuries in First Nations communities. We're working closely with the Aboriginal Firefighters Association of Canada to raise awareness about the importance of fire prevention on reserve. This work includes providing funding for an annual Firefighter Skill Development Challenge, as well as for fire prevention activities for school children. Mr. Speaker, our government believes that all Canadians deserve to feel safe and secure in their homes, no matter where they live. That is why we're actively working with our partners to ensure First Nations on reserve in Saskatchewan and across Canada meet this rigorous standard. Thank you.
The honourable member for Churchill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the willingness put forward by the Parliamentary Secretary of Aboriginal Affairs. It's a sentiment that we certainly didn't hear from the Minister in the House the day after the tragedy in Makwasagahigan. But what there really needs to be is a recognition from this government that what we are talking about is systemic underfunding. So while, yes, there is an investigation happening in Makwa, as it should, there are too many First Nations across this country that have gone through that same tragedy. We do not need to wait for another child or another elder or anyone to die in a house fire on reserve for any reason, but certainly the lack of fire equipment, certainly the lack of resources to support firefighters, or more important, and equally importantly, the lack of resources to properly equip houses are the issues that we need to be addressing. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to say that in recognizing that this is a systemic issue, we need systemic change, and that's where we hope to see this federal government take action.
Honourable Parliament Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I indicated in my original response, we certainly have provided ongoing consistent funding to the First Nation in question, whether it's $45,000 for a fire truck or ongoing fire prevention and fire protection funds. We take the health and safety of First Nations communities as this one very seriously. We place a premium on working with willing partners to raise awareness about the importance of fire safety and protection. Our government's Be Fire Safe campaign, as well as funding we provide to the Aboriginal Firefighters Association of Canada to raise awareness about fire safety, are excellent examples of this commitment. We continue to provide our support to the Makwasagahigan First Nation to work with them to prevent similar tragic events from happening in the future, as we do with other First Nations right across the country.